Good evening, everyone, and welcome to ACME Conversations. My name is Ari. I'm the public programs producer here. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that today we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And of course, I'd like to pay respect to people of all nations who are present in the audience tonight, and of course, to all of our amazing panelists. So, what an amazing panel lineup do we have for the penultimate ACME Conversation for 2018 tonight. And I'd just like to introduce you to our inimitable host, Michelle Law. Michelle is a writer working across film, theatre and print. She's the co-author of the comedy book Shit Asian Mothers Say, and her writing has appeared in numerous books as well as publications, including Frankie Magazine and the Sydney Morning Herald. Her debut play, Single Asian Female, was staged at La Boite Theatre Company and Belvoir Street Theatre Company to sold-out audiences. She's also been a recipient of the Queensland Premier's Young Publishers and Writers Award. Homecoming Queens, the award-winning web series she co-created, co-wrote and stars in, premiered on SBS On Demand this year. Please put your hands together for Michelle Law.
Thank you, Ari. That was so incredibly thorough and lovely. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for tonight's panel, Chinese Australian Representation on Screen. I was so curious when I was putting this panel together as to sort of who would turn up and who would be interested. So it's amazing to hear that the event sold out and to see so many lovely new faces in the audience. Tonight, I'm really, really stoked because we have an incredible array of panellists, all of whom I dearly love and respect. We've got Tony Ayres on my far left, producer, writer, director extraordinaire. Corrie Chen, director, screenwriter, and my professional sister wife. And Lawrence Leung, comedian, actor, and screenwriter. We are going to sort of run through a bit about ourselves, each individually, and we're going to kick off with a bit of a presentation from Lawrence. But the first thing we're going to see is a pretty well-known clip from Neighbours. Is anyone familiar with the Lim family from Neighbours? This was back, I think it was in 1989 or 1990 when they first appeared?
Yeah, it was about 1990.
1990.
Yeah.
So this was one of the first Asian families on Ramsay Street, and we're just going to see them now. If we could please roll the clip. Oh, I have to go, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful.
Oh.
Oh, incredible.
Okay.
Oh, the power.
You don't think the Lims, You know, now that you mention it, that dog did go very quiet quite suddenly last night. And then they lit a barbecue.
Really?
Yes. I didn't recognize the smell either.
Yes, she paid us a visit.
So you admit it?
Admit what? She wandered in and played with Tommy until it was time for dinner.
Have you no shame?
What are you talking about?
Poor Hannah. How am I supposed to tell her that her pet was barbecued?
How dare you suggest such a thing? I've never been so insulted.
That sort of thing might be acceptable in your country, Mrs. Lim, but in Australia we consider it barbaric.
Could you walk us through what's just happened in this scene, Lawrence?
It needs no explanation. That is vintage racism 1989. Mwah. I edited together that clip with the subtitles, or at the end there I like to call it subtext, because I had it shown in a comedy festival season in Perth, Sydney, and also Melbourne. I did it on stage, and I found when I showed that clip in front of different audiences, they kind of reacted like you guys did. You start off laughing hysterically, and then all of a sudden you go quiet with horror. And it's really interesting because after doing it in the comedy festival shows, I remember one night there was a group of teenagers who spoke to me afterwards. They really liked the show, and they're saying, "Oh, we really love that comedy sketch you made." That means that it is so racist that they could not believe that it was real, that this was on Australian TV when I was growing up. When a lot of us were growing up, we actually saw this on television. And I found, as a kid, luckily for me, I had also other kinds of I guess it wasn't seeing Australians, Chinese Australians on television. My relationship was with yellow faces like The Simpsons. That's, to me, the closest thing I got to seeing yellow faces on TV. And for me, the proxy Asian was, of course, Lisa Simpson, with her overachieving, playing instrument at a very young age, academically excellent. But for me, seeing more Asians in Hollywood films was kind of where I got my heroes from. I'll show you, if you pass me this, I'll show you, these were my 3 heroes at the time. Let's have a look. So there was, first of all, there was Data, who was the guy who made all the gadgets in the Goonies. I really related to him. And there's also Short Round, Indiana Jones's sidekick in the Temple of Doom. And also Kim, the computer science president in Encino Man. So in the 1980s in Hollywood and early 90s as well, these 3 were the only Asians that I found myself relating to. And to give you a sense of the lack of diversity and the lack of Asian representation, these are all the same actor.
Oh, God.
This is Jonathan Kwan. So if there are any white people in the audience who are freaking out quietly, in 1980s Hollywood, all Asians literally did look the same. But unfortunately, screen representation, of course, all of these guys were seen as, they were geeks. So the Asian representation of males in Hollywood were always, nerdy, emasculated. They weren't the sexy, hunky Asian stereotype. So in 2010, I tried to change that, and I failed miserably. This is Choose Your Own Adventure, a publicity photo where the director off-screen kept saying to me during the photo shoot, "Can you try to look less like a 5-year-old with a beard?" It was a comedy documentary series I made for the ABC, and the central premise was, what did you want to do when you were a kid but you never got around to because you grew up? So I got to make, with a documentary film crew, trying to be like a breakdancer in the streets of South Central LA. I tried wrestling. I tried to be a Guinness World Record holder by jumping out of a plane, solving a Rubik's Cube before pulling the parachute. But the final episode's theme was about seeking acceptance of myself as an Asian Australian. And it's not really the kind of thing that ABC would usually have on primetime TV. And it's no mistake that I kind of snuck this personal episode as the final episode after all the broad fun and hijinks. Because a lot of people like me growing up, they had that internal conflict of being between 2 cultures, in this case, Asian and Australian or Anglo. And I also wanted to wrestle with that parental guilt of the expectations of migrant parents. So to this end, I flew in this series to the US to meet my namesake nemesis, the other #1 Lawrence Leung on Google, Professor Lawrence Leung, the world's leading heart surgeon and hematologist, a man my parents wanted me to be. And I asked him advice on how he found his identity and how I should find mine. And this episode was also wrestling with the guilt that children of immigrants feel about losing their parents' language and heritage. But I did this in a karaoke-inspired music video called Why Can't I Be More Chinese? That I was told was studied by VCE students in social studies classes. I tried to find the clip for tonight, but I couldn't, and that's probably a good thing because my singing and violin playing is a disgrace to any race. So.
Do you actually play violin, though?
Yeah, I played violin, I played flute, and a little bit of piano, but I'm not very good at that.
What a way to perpetuate your stereotype.
I know, but I'm bad at maths, so
Oh, so am I. Yeah.
swings and
Wow,
roundabouts.
throwing me under the bus, Corey.
That's why we do the arts. So at the time, Choose Your Own Adventure was celebrated as the first Asian TV show created, written and fronted by an Asian, which was extremely humbling, especially when I started getting emails from young Chinese Australians saying, finally, a face like ours on screen. And I never intended this to represent 5-year-olds with beards. But the show was based on my angst-ridden stand-up comedy routines and in pubs and theatres, and it was kind of like a comedic catharsis. So I actually intended to make the show for myself, but it turns out I also inadvertently had made the show for young Aussie Asians as well. And I also featured my parents in it. There they are there. And they got to play my parents, and not some racist stereotypes, with canine barbecues. They stole the show and they played themselves convincingly. And by convincingly, I mean they were disappointed by my performance in every scene that was shared. And they unfairly compared me to my older brother, who's not an actor or a comedian, he's a pharmacist. So try as you might to defy, stereotypes in your professional life, in your personal life, sometimes your parents just are happy being stereotypes. But assumptions do follow you into professional life, because I remember my first day at the ABC, and this was like, the first week of pre-production. And I was going into the ABC Ultimo building in the headquarters in Sydney, and I passed this glass cabinet with bananas and pyjamas, yellow on the outside, white on the inside, brothers. And then I was thinking to myself, maybe this weird, Asian stand-up's finally made it. I finally made it. And then I got into the elevator, and I remember this guy, this older white man wearing a suit. He was probably from upper management. We were going up the elevator, and he turned to me and he asked me sort of advice on how to fix his computer. So he had mistaken me, or he just assumed that I was an IT support guy, and not someone at the ABC who was commissioned to make a 6-part series. And so what did I do? I told him to turn his router on and off again. Because that's the problem. Even though I had every right to tell him to get stuffed, my imposter syndrome kicked in, and that's that familiar anxiety that a lot of people have, that I had growing up in high school, is that it was a constant reminder that someone who looks like me perhaps doesn't belong here. After the success of the show, the ABC let me make another series, which was Unbelievable, which was called Unbelievable. It was a science comedy series, critically acclaimed, but I'm still not an Asian male sex symbol. And then Tony Ayres, who was at Matchbox Pictures at the time, he said, "Hey, would you like to star in Maximum Choppage? It's a kung fu action show." And I thought, this is my chance to be that sexy Asian lead. But Lawrence, your character's a coward who doesn't do kung fu. No worries. So this is Maximum Choppage. Proudly, Maximum Choppage, much which was filmed in Cabramatta itself, was the first Australian show with a 90% Asian cast. There are actors from various backgrounds. We had Vietnamese, Cambodian, Chinese, 3 Tokelan Anglo people, because I believe it's important to support opportunities for white people. They do such great things for the community. Their food. Fish together with chips. So I've noticed that the doors of opportunity for Asian creators and actors recently have been increasing, mostly probably because of Tony Ayres and your not so secret Asian agenda. Matchbox Pictures also made, this is some scenes from Maximum Choppage. So they also made Family Law, which I was honoured to help storyline in the writer's room and pen. One of the episodes was season 2. And as an actor, I always see scripts where the main characters would always be described like this, that have John, and in brackets, mid-30s tall, whereas actors of Eastern heritage were always, characters of Eastern heritage were always described as things like John, in brackets, mid-30s, Asian. As if being Asian was that catch-all defining character trait. Not even which specific Southeast Asian background, just generic mid-30s, you're an Oriental. When I was writing scripts for Maximum Choppage and Family Law, I really loved writing descriptions for characters like Mayor Crawford, 50s, white. That inversion really tickled me. And it's a cheeky script writing tradition that I kept up when I made a feature film called Sucker, which was an adaptation of my first ever stand-up comedy show. It starred veteran actor Timothy Spall, mid-60s, white. And the lead was played by a young Asian performer named John Luke. It took a long time to get this film up, and I'd turned down so many producers over the years who wanted to adapt it with an all-white cast. Typical. But things started improving slowly in casting, and I found in recent times I've been offered acting roles in mainstream or whiter shows with more diversity in the cast. Maybe that's what they're thinking. So I always seem, it's baby steps, because I always seem to be cast as a doctor, which my parents love. So this is Ten's Offspring, I played 3 seasons as a nervous, awkward Dr. Elvis Kwan. And then in Newton's Law, I played a doctor. Nervous and awkward. For Jane Campion's Top of the Lake, I played an IT geek. Still nervous and awkward, but also a misogynist. So, against type.
Nice addition.
Yay!
Three-dimensional.
Yeah, I know. Nuanced. So nuanced. One day, I hope to play more nuanced Eastern characters on big screen, like those inspirational Asian actors such as Scarlett Johansson and Emma Stone. That's big fans of Scarlett playing Motoko Kusanagi and Emma Stone's character in Aloha. The character name is Alison Ng, who's quarter Chinese, quarter Hawaiian, and 100% bullshit. So where are we today? Have things improved for Asian representation? So I think over the last 10 years for me in stand-up comedy and TV and film, I've noticed there's this massive seismic shift around the corner. And I personally experienced this shockwave last year when I received a call to audition for a role in a movie called Crazy Rich Asians. One fan of the one fan. The part was a character called Charlie Wu, who will appear as one of the main characters in the next movie, the sequel that's already been greenlit. And finally, I could achieve my dream of helping create the new Asian stereotype of devastatingly hunky, dolphin-skinned Asian man. Who's seen Crazy Rich Asians?
Woo!
Yeah. If you're watching carefully, the dashing Charlie Wu appears in the final scene
He's handsome.
of Crazy Rich Asians in the end credit sequence.
Yeah.
When Astrid looks over the crowd and locks eyes with an overwhelmingly handsome man. I didn't get the role. When I watched the film, I saw this guy beat me in the auditions. There he is there. There we are, Harry Sum Jr. So it's so sad they went for, once again, the emasculated dorky geek. I guess Hollywood will never be ready for this. In conclusion, I want to say I'm more hopeful than when I was a kid watching Neighbours. The people on the panel here tonight with me have made content with Asian characters and voices and rich storytelling. And in the end, that's what people want to see, which is great stories, hopefully with some hot Asians. So if there are any progressive producers out there tonight looking for a crazy ripped Asian, I'm available. I'm fine with nudity from the neck up.
Would you ever shave your beard?
No, that's all I've got. But I'll hand it over back to you guys.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lawrence. That was incredible. It was so amazing to see all of the highlights from your career that we're going to keep on touching on in the discussion. It was interesting what you mentioned about, when you first started stand-up, and we were chatting about this before the actual panel, about consciously denying that part of your heritage and not wanting to be seen as like the Asian comedian. And I think that's something that we all share in common as, I guess, naturalized Asian Australians or people who migrated or, who were second generation immigrants. I wanted to flick it over to Tony and just talk about, that autobiographical element as well, because your feature Home Song Stories was inspired, or it is based on your childhood and your experiences migrating to Australia with your mother and sister.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you talked about the idea that I came from a generation where it was all about fitting in, assimilating, and so I wasn't even encouraged by my mum, who didn't speak very much English, to speak Chinese. So as I got older and she got older, we just couldn't communicate anymore. But she didn't want me to speak Mandarin. She didn't want me to learn it. She wanted me to fit in, and so and I remember seeing some of William Yang's work and really connecting to that as well, because it just seemed to be a generational thing at a certain, when I was growing up, so I became like a total banana, a yellow on the outside and white on the inside, not being able to connect to what it was to be Chinese. And weirdly enough, it was when I was at art school, at film school, I started, like you were told to write what you knew. And so I just wrote these very personal stories. And Home Song Stories actually started as a half-hour piece called The Long Ride, which I wrote in my final year at film school. It was just about my mother, my sister, and me going on a taxi ride that went for 100 miles. And my mother ended up, and we had lunch with this guy who it turned out was my mother's lover. And and we had no idea. And then we got, and meanwhile the taxi driver was trying to chat up my mum and stuff. And it was just a very simple story. And then it did really well, and it won the Augie that year, and it won the AFI award for best miniseries or telemovie, which was hilarious because it was only half an hour long. And then I suddenly was like the Chinese writer, and I spent my entire life avoiding being Chinese, and suddenly I got offered all these jobs. But through that, I actually had to, because I only really knew my stories, but one of the jobs that I got offered was this really ambitious piece about the Chinese in Australia, which was called The Wives of Kwong. The ABC were doing it, and it never got made, but honestly, Penny Chapman, who is now one of the partners we set up Matchbox with, she was head of drama at that stage, and she ended up getting William Yang to travel around the country for a year and just do oral histories. And the research he did was phenomenal. He came back with these incredible stories about, the goldfields, but also the Northern Territory, the Chinese in the Northern Territory, which I knew nothing about. All these beautiful little stories that he met people all around the country. And from that, we put together a mini-series, which was 3 generations of these Chinese women based and set in Darwin. And it was like, knowing the industry now, I realised it was absolutely impossible to make, because it was so expensive. But for me, I worked on it for about 4 years, and it was a real, I immersed myself into a world and a culture that it was like I was being forced to learn how to be Chinese.
It was a homecoming. And that was something that we were chatting to as well. It feels like the older you get, the more comfortable you become in your own heritage, and the more you want to become reconciled with it. Yeah. But then beyond that, you then went on to work on a breadth of many different projects, some very small selection here. Yeah. Do you feel a pressure to represent Chinese stories, or to be the person who tells them? I mean, we talk a lot, and we've talked a lot in past panels about, the Asian mafia and the industry. Could you speak to that a bit?
Well, I what's exciting now is that it looks like there isn't it's the beginnings of something. Like, for a long time, it was just me. Like, it really, it was a very lonely gang.
You're the godfather.
It was a very lonely gang. I was the godfather, godmother, godchild. Like, there was one other guy called Tek Tan, who I went to film school with, and people, he was Malaysian Chinese, people always called me Tek, and they always called him Tony. We looked nothing alike, but it was funny. It was a joke. And but then he went to Malaysia because he couldn't get any work here. So then for about 15 years, there wasn't anyone. There weren't very many people around making work, and certainly not making work that was kind of being broadcast. So I did feel, and as I became aware that those generations were not following the way that I naturally assumed they would, I thought, well, it's important for me to try to find stories and find avenues for Asian Australian creators to tell their stories. And so that was why, when I read The Family Law, I just thought, that's it, and Maximum Choppage, that was it, and that's still an impulse for me, but I don't feel I don't, no one really heavies me about it.
Yeah, right.
I don't feel any pressure to do it, but it's just what I really want to do. And when I read your piece about the importance of, why it was important to see yourself on screen and the effect that it had, it really rang true to me, because I absolutely recognise that feeling of diminution that I think we all have. I call it rather the imposter syndrome. It's like the coolie syndrome. We all sort of feel this thing where we're not as good as other people, and no matter what you do, I mean, I think we all overachieve as a way of compensating.
Yes.
But and I noticed that with a lot of my Chinese friends, that we all recognise that, we all know that, and I think part of it is growing up where you're always something else, where you can't recognise yourself.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the history of the Chinese in Australia, and how fraught the relationship is between Chinese Australians and Anglo-Australians. I mean, the reason I wanted to make this panel so specific to Chinese culture and not just broadly speaking about Asian culture is that the Chinese have been in Australia for centuries. I mean, we are the oldest migrants to have come here, and yet, it's incredible that we're seeing increased diversity on TV and on our screens. We've got the incredible film Ali's Wedding. We had Lion come out as well. We had these incredible multicultural stories that are reflective of modern Australia, but you really do rarely see Chinese Australian people. I mean, we're lucky now that we've got the Family Law and Maximum Choppage and the Home Song Stories and Floating Life.
Homecoming Queens. We're seeing more work.
We're seeing more work, but it's why has it taken this long? And I want to keep chatting about this, but I also want to hear a bit about Corrie's work as well as a screenwriter and a director, because you actually migrated to Australia when, were you 9 or 10?
I was 10, yeah, it was in the mid-90s, and it's strange listening to you talking about childhood, because I was very similar in a lot of ways in that, my parents were obsessed with Australia, and that's one of the reasons why we moved here, because they had an Australian restaurant in Taiwan that went bankrupt because no one wanted to eat toasties and stuff in late 80s, early 90s. It was called Koala. Anyway, sent them bankrupt, and they're like, well, why don't we just move there and live our dream? So when we got here, my dad was like, you can't speak Mandarin at home. We're just going to go fully fledged into being the best Australians we can. So they're really the perfect immigrants. They even vote Liberal now. Like, they're just, like, the Liberal Party would love them. But because of that, I spent just my entire childhood, teenage years, pretending to myself and actually believing that I was not Asian. I was so desperate to be white. And I learnt English watching Australian television as well. So it was very easy to keep up that lie to myself on a daily basis.
What were the shows that you watched?
I watched a lot of Neighbours, and I watched a lot of ABC.
I saw the Limbs.
Yeah. So that was, and a lot of Sesame Street, actually. And so it was when I got to uni where I was being forced into a world where I was judged on that initial first impression, and everyone assumed I was an international student immediately. And it was like every day in every single new class, I had to fight that perception. And like, I made sure I spoke English very quickly and very like complicated sentences for no reason. Like when someone would ask, how are you? And I would be like, well, let me talk to you about politics. Just so that they knew I wasn't an international.
I used to call people mate all the time. Mate.
Yeah, and like I just wanted them to know that I went to all of high school here and what school I went to, and just so that they would accept me. And they still didn't. That's the thing. I was still relegated to the coloured corner of the room. And same here. It was going to VCA when they were like, what is your voice? What do you really want to say? And that was when I started to sort of unpick at the wound that I thought had, been buried, and really started leaning into my culture, as well as being introduced to Michelle, because Michelle was, I think, my second Asian friend that I had really allowed into my life. And I was like 20,
I'm honoured.
I think 23 or 24 at the time. And and it was sort of meeting someone where I went, oh, I don't have to explain myself to you. And that's so weird. Like, it's okay to just like eat Chinese food without feeling ashamed. And yeah, it was, so I think that community is what's so important about what's happening right now.
Did you find it infiltrating your work? Because, you know, with your shorts, and then you went on to work on these incredible shows as well as others.
Yeah, I think with me, when I was sort of clamoring to realize what I wanted to do, Asian Australian cinema was, you know, few and far between. There was your work, which is actually one of the first sort of Asian Western filmmakers I came across. And because I'm from Taiwan, Ang Lee was a really big force as well in my learning. And looking at his body of work, that was something I really tried to emulate, in that it's so enormous. And I'm interested in the feeling of being an outsider, less so the visual representation, even though that's important to me as well. So I have kept up a really diverse diverse body of work. In that I've made stories about like white men as well, sorry. But
You're out of the mafia.
yeah.
Get out. Okay, just going off of that and that, I guess, reconciliation to your own identity and becoming more comfortable with that. We were chatting earlier about the first film that I wrote and we worked on together, which was called Bloomers. So it's just on this next slide. Oh, no, that's Lawrence. Not all Asians are the same. And I remember when I first wrote this, I knew that I just subconsciously knew that I had to make the protagonist white, because I felt like if she's not white, aka neutral, then who will want to watch this film? And that's something that I think I made that about 10 years ago now, and that's something that I think about now, how after, you know, a lot of self-education, a lot of reading and reflection as well, that I realise how much I've internalised that sort of self-hatred and the denial of who you are and your heritage. And I think that's why Corey and I have worked so well together in that, you know, when we're not trying to make films about that per se, but we're acknowledging that that is an intrinsic part of your intersectional experience as a person of colour or a woman of colour. So I'll just talk very briefly about my own work as well. So I have a literary background, so I actually studied creative writing at preschool. And then I actually fell into screenwriting when I was 18, when I started working on a show sort of writing interactive media, and then I realised that that was really where my heart was. I think I started writing a book because I was being pressured to, and I just realised that I was really miserable because I wanted to create something that was visual and impactful in a way that would reach the masses and be broadcast on commercial television, or just reach people in a way that I would have loved to have been reached when I was a child growing up just watching commercial broadcast TV. So I started writing shorts, and then Corey and I made a documentary together about suicide prevention in Australia. We then worked on Homecoming Queens, which was the first SBS online commission for their SBS On Demand platform. And then I've gone on to work on, you know, different writers' rooms, and I worked on The Bureau of Magical Things, which is a new kids show on Channel 11, which excitingly has an Asian Australian lead actress. So that is something that I love as well. But something that I wanted to talk about as well, just in the context of this, is that, you know, there's an Asian lead actress in this kids show, and that's something that you would have never seen a decade ago. And it feels like things are starting to change, and that there is this, you know, especially with Asian American diversity at the moment, you've got Crazy Rich Asians, you've got To All the Boys I Loved Before, you've got the new Marvel film coming out with the Korean American protagonist, and it seems like there's a shift. particularly to do with the East Asian diaspora. But what is happening in Australia? Like, where are we in parallel to that? Are we even close? Are we 10 years off? And why do you think so? I mean, Corey, you and I were chatting about this on the radio this morning.
Yeah, it's because, we were just recently in the US when we got back last week, and I think it was quite interesting in the rooms seeing the vocabulary in which they used to speak about diversity, and I think there is, it does feel that much more advanced than here. There's still a feeling to me that there is a lot of explaining that has to happen before the defensiveness drops and any decent discussions can be had in my own personal experience. Whereas in a lot of the meetings we had, with Netflix and whatever, it was immediately like, so what is the, what is the level of representation in Australian screens? Like, they just confronted it head on immediately. And I think, I don't know if it's a cultural thing where Australians still find the idea of racism really hard to comprehend, or even its existence to be real. And, I think until that changes, it feels like we are a number of years behind. Not to say that things aren't changing.
Do you think it's an industry problem or a systemic racism problem, or a bit of a mixture? Because I just want to read a couple of stats from the 2016 census. So more than 1 million new migrants have come to Australia since 2011, with China and India the most common countries of birth for new arrivals. And after English, the most common languages are Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Arabic. I think the Asian population in Australia is comparable to the African American population in America. But what is happening?
I think that one of the things that surprised, because I worked in a company that got bought by the big American company, NBC Universal, and one of the things that I noticed when I first encountered the American industry, for instance, in television, there was precedence of diversity at every network. Like, that was an issue. But I think that the difference is that in America, it is driven by a capitalist sort of economy. I mean, it's a genuine market economy insofar as that all of the size of the market is so big that, all of those subsectors are significant audiences. So there's a huge Hispanic audience. There's a huge black audience, African American audience. There's a huge, I think that Asian Americans are probably the most passive and the least represented, but that's changing now as well. But that was almost part of what those companies had to do to actually exist. In Australia, we have a much smaller industry, and so it's much more based on government funding and policy, and also advertising, and so you've got this combination of a fairly entrenched, say in the commercial networks, you've got a fairly entrenched view of the world, which is dominated by a certain kind of person, predominantly, older, white, straight, male. I think that's pretty much been the case for most of the history of the Australian networks. And so you've got that on one side, and then you had government policy on the other side, which really, up until, I would say, 5 years ago, I would say that diversity was just a box that was ticked. It was never taken very seriously, and for most of my career, it's never been really an issue. But suddenly, I think the pivot is that issue is changing, and so you've got a market that's driven by these two forces, and the force that's making the market change now is at a policy level. Like, it's being taken much more seriously, and it's being enacted. And I think that we will see the fruits of that in about 5 years, maybe 10 years. I think that'll be when the work starts to flow, but particularly 5 years, because I think more work is being developed now.
do you feel like as creators, when you when you're pitching projects or when they're being commissioned, and the people who are at the gate who are offering you these opportunities, do you feel like it can often be a box ticking exercise, or do the people in control, are they responding to this current climate of political correctness and promoting diversity because they have to, otherwise they'll be torn apart on the internet? Or do you think that they are actually committed to change?
I'm hoping they're committed to change, because even in a commercial sense, there's a large audience that they can tap into, and also new stories rather than hearing the same old stories and seeing the same old subjectivity over and over again. I think audiences out there are dying to see something fresh and new, something that's a bit different, but also still feels universal and relatable to themselves. I certainly know from coming from stand-up comedy that I think that when I started, it was the only way to get in, because there were less gatekeepers. I could think of something and literally tell the story on stage that night, and I was only beholden to myself and the audience. No one was telling me, you can't get on stage if you just get on stage. And I think as I've sort of moved through to other mediums, be it TV or film, there's a lot more gatekeepers you have to kind of cross the threshold of and convince. And I feel like it's slowly changing now, because of the conversation about representation and diversity can make something stronger, because it's not the same thing that everyone's seen all along. But also I think because of the internet, people can have these discussions, and previously we couldn't articulate what it is that, as audience members, we feel about something, but now people can share it online and it's out there and people can hear what the culture is thinking about.
Yeah, it's really in the power of the tribe now, isn't it? And it's, back to your previous question, I feel like it's a little bit column A and column B, like it's both, but it feels like to stay relevant, whether or not, whether they like it or not, they really have to engage with what's in the cultural zeitgeist, and that is having a variety of different kinds of people and faces in the stories that are being made.
Sure, yeah. I just want to chat a bit, I just want to flick through a couple of these slides, just looking at Chinese history in Australia, over the last several centuries. This is quite an infamous image from the Bulletin, back when it was still being published, about Yellow Peril. If you haven't seen it before, it's quite a striking one that has stayed with me and is seared in my memory. I want to talk a bit about everyone's backgrounds, because so I'm Chinese Australian. My parents migrated from Hong Kong. I'm just curious to know what everyone's backgrounds are.
My parents are from Hong Kong.
Yep.
I was born here, but they came in the 70s.
And we speak Cantonese, or sort of.
I can only speak Cantonese at a three-year-old toddler level.
Oh, we'd have a good conversation then, because I'm probably the same.
So I know how to say chak nga.
It's important.
And that's it. That's about it.
Well, you've got good teeth then.
I do.
Corey?
Chinese.
Wait, am I the best Chinese person on this panel?
Probably.
Because I can speak Mandarin.
Leave.
Wow.
So you're from Taiwan,
Yeah,
obviously.
I'm from Taiwan. I came when I was 10, and I was homeschooled for a couple of years by my mom. So, and that was when I sort of learned English, because we had visa issues and whatever. And then I also went to Chinese school and stuff for a bit before I was expelled because my Mandarin was terrible. So I can still speak Mandarin enough to get around China and Taiwan and so forth. But yeah, my writing is pretty poor.
And Tony?
Yeah.
Just near Hong Kong. I was born in Macau.
Yep.
So we're not a very diverse panel.
Well, it's interesting.
So many flags.
So many flags.
Well,
Well, I was curious to know, because I wonder if part of the dodgy representation of Chinese people on our screens is because we're often just made this amalgamation of Chinese when there's no recognition of political divisions between different
Yeah.
Asian countries. There's
Or
no
class divisions.
no class
Yeah.
divisions. There's really no
Religious,
exploration of that, and this is more of a comment. And I think that's because the storytellers who are in those rooms don't have that authentic experience or ethnic background in order to. Corey, yeah.
Yeah. Oh no, sorry. I was just like the number of times in writers' rooms when you're often the only Asian person and there's an Asian character being created, and suddenly you just feel all these white faces turn and look at you
Yeah.
when they have a question that needed to be answered about like, what do Chinese people think of hell? And like, well, as I'm speaking on behalf of all Chinese people,
1 billion people think this.
this is what they think. Yeah.
So what do they? I wanted to chat about some of the seminal Chinese Australian works out there, which Tony has had a hand in making many of them. So we've got Tony's film, The Home Song Stories, Floating Life, Family Law, Maximum Choppage. We've got these portrayals, and we've got other portrayals like The Limbs on Neighbours and The Mail Order Bride on Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, who really undercut quite a progressive, diverse film, I thought. Why are those depictions so different? Like, why is one more authentic than the other? What makes a portrayal of a Chinese person authentic?
I personally think that it's great that there is such a difference, because I think that, I feel uncomfortable with words like Asian even, because, I might have gotten this wrong in my reading, but I always thought that was a Western word, that it was a Western construct, and that people in, what we know as Asia don't think of themselves as Asian. I got told that because at one stage my partner Michael and I were trying to do an Asian version of Eurovision. And we kept getting told, no, Asians won't be into that.
But also, what's Europe? Because Australia competes in Eurovision.
Yeah. But anyway, so personally, I like the fact that there are so many different kinds of representation, because if you I just grew up trying to sort of say, well, not all Chinese people are like this, and so if the healthier our screen culture is, the more diverse that our representations of what even being Chinese is, because that I think will help break down those stereotypes of, because I don't mind a stereotype if it's funny, because that's comedy, but I think that it's actually about enough breadth of representation so that we get a whole bunch of different stories, and so then we stop seeing the single Asian story. Because the other thing that we've got all in common is that we're all sort of, caught between two cultures in different ways. But that is a particular story. Whereas, there are other stories out there of people who are, completely, Chinese identified, being in a Western culture. And that's a very different story. And then there are stories of people who never leave the Chinese community within a Western culture. So all the people whose lives are absolutely caught up in Chinatown. We don't see those stories either.
Yes.
That's why I feel like I just want more.
Yes, I find that really interesting, and it leads into my next slide, which is the divisive figure of my Choni.
I just heard someone gasp.
Someone gasp. He's someone who people believe through his performance and through his characters on his show, The China Boy Show, that he perpetuates negative stereotypes. But he's a very interesting case because he got YouTube famous and a lot of his followers are Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh, heaps,
Yeah, so is this a case of Chinese Australians and the Chinese community at large sort of taking ownership of these stereotypes and in order to diminish their power? We talked about stereotypes being comedy, and I sort of had a similar experience when Ben and I wrote our comedy book, Shit Asian Mothers Say, and a bit of bad rap from people saying that we were perpetuating negative stereotypes with a $15 toilet read. So I'm just wondering where you think the line can be drawn, or if there is a line. And, who gets to make fun of who?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because it's like, who is in control of the laugh? Is it the audience? Is it the comedian? Or is it the person who gives the comedian the platform? It depends on whether, you know, you're punching up or punching down. Like if you're making fun of, is different to if you're celebrating or highlighting. I haven't seen the China Boys show, but I'm aware of my Chinese like YouTube work. And it's very much, it's a younger audience who see themselves in him, and they are, I think they're laughing because they recognise the tropes, more so than appreciating or laughing because someone may be inverting tropes. It's more about celebrating their recognition of it.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know. Like I've actually, because he's John Luke. He played my character in Sucker, and I remember when we were taking the film around, he was mobbed by Chinese, Vietnamese fans, and they were all of a particular 12 to 16 age group. So I wish I could stop down and ask what it is they see in this particular style of comedy, because I think that it speaks to them in a way which I would like to find out more.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
It's a
and I
younger
wonder
generation.
if it's an underserved audience. Underserved audience is a hungry audience, and maybe if I was a teenager, I would have also really loved this stuff.
Because it's a form of representation?
Yeah, and I'm like, because I've seen some of the stuff that he does with about his mum or something, and I get it. I intellectually understand why it's funny, but it's not for me. Not to say it's not for someone else. And I think his latest one is the China Boy one, and that, according to some Facebook groups that I've seen, caused more outrage than his YouTube work. A little part of me just wonders, like, maybe the China Boy show is just a lesser work than his YouTube stuff, and that's why, like, maybe it just wasn't executed in the way that other more successful works have been. And like, because sometimes you just, make stuff that isn't as good.
There was that thing in the Greek community about Wogs Out of Work.
Yes.
You know, it's really similar. That the characters in Wogs Out of Work were these big sort of stereotypes, but the audience was this young audience who recognised. I mean, the thing about comedy and stereotypes, archetypes, because that we had that with some blowback on that on Maximum Choppage. It's really hard to do comedy without big characters, and it's really hard to do big characters without leaning towards some kind of stereotype. I try to sort of say they're archetypes, which is just a different word for stereotype. But but it's really hard to actually do that. Like you look at most comedy, and it does kind of lean towards a certain kind of bigger than life character. Like you look at Woody Allen. His stuff. Well, you can't look at Woody Allen. When you could look at
Bill
Woody
Cosby.
Allen,
Oh no.
Not recently. Louis C.K.
it was all. There was the stereotype of the neurotic Jew. I think that it's very hard to do comedy in those ways.
Yeah, and all of us work in the comedy sphere in some way, or comedy writing, and all of our projects are comedic in some way. Does that mean that there are sort of some positives when it comes to being Chinese Australian, because you can make jokes about certain things that other people can't?
You can absolutely be more racist. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I don't think other people realise that other races beyond white people can be super racist.
Well, yeah, Chinese people can be
worst.
Have just got terrible.
I've got to say that
opinions.
Chinese people are probably the most racist people I know.
The ads in China, the way they portray black people in China is awful. Yeah, there's like a toothpaste with a black person. I think it's called like Negro toothpaste or something.
I think it's called
awful. Or something terrible. Yeah.
That's really on the nose.
Yeah.
In terms of our own work, we all work in comedy, but we also work from quite personal places. I wonder if that was ever a conscious decision, or, if you got further in your career, if it then became a conscious decision because you knew that you had maybe a particular fan base and you wanted to provide them with representation or content that they could relate to. Like, is it something you actively denied, or Lawrence, you did?
Yeah, when I first started doing stand-up, I didn't want to be the ethnic comedian because, I mean, that was a genre that people talked about when they talked about comedy and stand-up and coming out of wogs out of work, and that idea of very broad stereotypes on stage, a lot of character, and talking in stereotypes basically, and. Yeah, I didn't want to be that when I first started out. I just wanted to be me, but I didn't really know what me was. And so for many years, I was performing stand-up about all sorts of material, which was personal to me. I remember someone accused me of playing the race card because I was like talking about puzzles and mysteries and all that stuff on stage. Yeah, when I thought I was playing the geek card, the nerd card. Yeah, so it's really interesting that even then people would look at you and see you as being what they think of you as the Asian person in the room. Like you're saying, when you went to university, they went, oh, you're a foreign exchange student. There's assumptions that come preloaded. So yeah, I very much wanted to step away from that when I started my career. But then in the last few years, there's something bubbling underneath that was part of my identity that I'd been suppressing for so long. And then lately, I remember doing a stand-up comedy show, which was all about my family and my parents and stuff, and it went off. and I was thinking, why was it so? Why did it go so well? And it was because it was true.
Yeah.
It was me.
I think I've had a very similar experience to you in that in the start of my career, I really actively denied it. And then as I got older and you become more comfortable with yourself and who you are, there is the accusation of, oh, you're playing the race card, but I just wanted to speak about that as well, because I did a panel a couple of months ago, I think, with Shu Ling, my friend, moderating, and we were just chatting about, people accusing you of using the gender card or the race card, and this idea of the meritocracy, and I just really wanted to break down the idea that doesn't exist. Like, a meritocracy doesn't exist. Like, everybody has moved ahead in their career because of some connection or some card that they're playing. Like, everyone has a hand. It's just whether or not you're choosing to play that card. And so when people accuse me of doing it, I'm like, of course I'm going to play that card. You've been playing your white card, you've been playing your man card, you've been playing your straight card, or what have you. So that's just a comment. Corey, your work is quite... I actually have a clip that I'm going to play after your response to this, but just in terms of your own personal story.
Yeah, in my personal life, I repressed the Asian side, but sort of from the get-go in my work, I've always used it to explore what it feels like or what it means to be Asian Australian, which is, I guess, a little bit reverse to you. And for me, I never sat down and thought, time to start grappling with some Asian themes in my work. It was the only thing I sort of knew to be true and honest, I guess. And for me, it's a constant negotiation with myself in that I tick so many boxes. Well, actually, I only tick 3 boxes, but I can't just suddenly turn off one lens and go, I'm just going to see it through the Chinese Australian lens, and then ignore the female, ignore the gay lens. Like, everything in how I view the world or how I read the script is through the 3 prisms. And I'm just reminded of, in LA, Michelle and I went to an Asian American comedy night at the Laugh Factory. And I got incredibly depressed at the end of it and went really quiet.
It was pretty bad.
Yeah, and Michelle was like, are you okay? And I just went, it was the straightest night I had ever been to.
There were a lot of horrible dick jokes.
It was just really awful. And I just went like, oh, how weird to be in my community and still feel so unseen and alone. And it was just that sort of recognition of, for me, it's always about the feeling, not just what it looks like. And I guess that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. We just have a short clip from one of Corey's films called Happy Country. If we could go into that. Oh, next slide. Oh, beautiful. The future.
Let's begin. Listen. tonight?
Is weather lovely today?
No. Isn't weather lovely today?
什么不一样？
You're not asking question. You already see weather nice.
那为什么不说 Today weather is nice?
English is beautiful, not blunt like Chinese. Keep practicing. Good for baby to listen. That stinks. Doesn't the party start at 4? You hungry?
Something sweet?
Your favorite bean? You like red bean? You feel okay?
Yeah, just been a long day.
I love that scene. Can you speak a bit to that scene, Corey?
Yeah, I mean, I listened to a lot of English tapes as well. Like, just my dad just really went all out. So that the whole film is about a couple moving down from Sydney to Melbourne, and it was very much inspired by my own trip down with my parents. I actually originally wrote it through the point of view of a child, and then I realized the child was completely unnecessary in the story. So yeah, that was sort of where the structure came from. And with the bean thing, like when my mum and I went to the supermarket for the first time when we first moved to Australia, and when we saw red baked beans, we thought it was the Chinese red beans and thought it was like a sweet thing. We bought cans of it and got back and realized it's like the worst tasting thing in the world. I still can't handle baked beans to this day. Like, I think it's awful. Why is it so salty? Yeah,
poor actor.
and it's I know he ate a lot of it. Yeah, and I think it's just so much of my childhood was like, how do you become the best Australian possible? And as an adult, I started thinking about my mum a lot more in the trauma of uprooting and leaving your motherland. Sort of really in support of your husband's dream and what that would have felt like, and being forced to stop speaking your mother tongue to the man that you love. And yeah, and that was kind of what the film was investigating.
Thanks. I have one last slide and one more thing to chat about, but while we bring that up, I just wanted to let you know to percolate questions that you might have, and I'd love to get a very casual, chill conversation going, no holds barred, swear if you want to. So this is Corey on set of her other film, Wonder Boy, another short that she wrote and directed. And this is, I just wanted to put this in here because this is the first short film that I wrote and Corey directed, and this is how we met. And we didn't realize at the time that we were the original Crazy Rich Asians. Because we made a film about a white girl trying to get her period because she's being bullied for not menstruating at school. Little did we know that our director was Chinese Australian.
Yeah.
I was Chinese Australian. Zhao Chen, our producer, was Chinese Australian, and our DOP, Matt Chung, was Chinese Australian.
It was just it was just best people for the job, I guess.
So the people are out there. You just need to look.
Yeah.
So in his Emmys acceptance speech for Master of None, Alan Young, who is a massive figurehead as a producer, creator, showrunner in the US now, he worked on Parks and Recreation. He's created a new series called Forever that has Maya Rudolph and Fred Armstead in it. And he co-created Master of None with Aziz Ansari. He said in his speech, there's 17 million Asian Americans in this country and there's 17 million Italian Americans. They have The Godfather, Goodfellas, Rocky, and The Sopranos. We got Long Duk Dong, the notorious Asian character from 16 Candles, so we've got a long way to go. Whose responsibility do you think is it to create this change? I mean, is the onus on the industry? Is it on us as creators? Are we sort of lacking the cohesiveness of other minority groups? I mean, we saw like the African Americans coming together with Black Panther, and other minority groups seem to do so well at coming together and being angry, but we haven't gotten there.
I think that part of it is structural. Again, if you look at the way the Australian industry works, and for instance, you compare Asian Australian representation with Indigenous representation, and you look at the way funding bodies like the Australian Film Commission, SBS, put a lot of money and support into representing that Indigenous filmmakers, and it's created this culture which is now perpetuating itself, and there's such a wealth of talent. And that was kind of what I meant earlier when I said that I didn't think that other cultures were taken seriously, in terms of representation of other kinds of cultures. So you could change things. For instance, if you said, we are completely underrepresented, Asian Australians are completely underrepresented, we're going to make sure that there are a certain number of these projects funded, that will change the landscape, because this is the way that our industry actually works. But I personally think the onus is on us. I think it's about us telling our stories and making them irresistible and making them for audiences that want to see those stories. We know that audiences will go to those stories if they're well told. I really think that it's about more and more people telling more and more stories. And the more people we have, the bigger the gang is,
The big mafia.
Yeah, and I think the backing and feeling really, emboldened by your own community as well. That is one of the biggest things Crazy Rich Asians has done. It sort of really lit this firecracker in the US especially, where there are a lot more Asians in positions of great power than here, and and that was really incredibly exciting to see and hear firsthand from Asian Americans kind of going. Now they've got like groups that meet every single month of powerful agents and managers and so forth to discuss it. With Crazy Rich Asians, when it came out, they had people booking out cinemas and getting other people to come, and hashtags like Goat Open and stuff, which also then helped Searching, which is like a little indie film that has done so well. That was all on a computer screen, and I think it just really rode that wave. So I'm really interested to see what the next film is going to be that captures that and keeps it going.
Yeah, and also just how audiences receive things, the fact that people are spreading the messages on, social media. Like, I wouldn't have known about, what's that teenage film with...
Oh, To All the Boys I Love?
Yeah, I wouldn't have known about that if people hadn't started talking about that. I think the community is sharing the things around, so we can share what we love to others, and I think that's going to build the groundswell that will convince people that there is a thing worth watching, and which is more voices and more stories.
The question that I wanted to end on, I want to end on this because it honours both the work that has been achieved and the work that is yet to be done, and it is what is something in the past year that has given you hope, and what is something that brought you down. I think for me, the thing that gave me hope was Crazy Rich Asians going gangbusters. I saw that film and literally just cried throughout it and it was from the opening credits because I heard that soundtrack and I was just like, "Wah!" Like, this sounds like something that resembles my home life. Something that brings me down, I suppose, the past year. Oh gosh, there's so many to choose from. Probably there can be a level of infighting, I think, within minority communities. And I think that, you know, there are people who are like, this is what it means to be a good Asian, and this is a bad Asian representation. And I really feel like there needs to be more cohesiveness if we're going to actually move somewhere.
Are we going this way?
Oh, we can be anyone.
Something that didn't bring me down was also Crazy Rich Asians, because at the very end of the movie, I was like, I'm so glad it didn't suck. Like, it felt like there was so much pressure on it. And I laughed throughout the film. And I was there with my partner, and we went to one of those baby cradle screenings. So
Bubs and Arms.
Bubs and Arms screaming. My 20-month-old baby was there, and just, you know, staring at the screen. And for us, this was a big deal, but I would love the fact that when she grows up and becomes an age where she can understand what's happening, that it's not a big deal at all, that this is such a big deal, this film.
Yeah. Did anything bring you down? If not, good.
Did anything... I'll come back to you on that.
All right.
Yeah.
Corey.
Well, I guess the photo reminded me, like, Kathy Yang in the middle is directing a DC movie in Hollywood at the moment. There's another director, Chloe, I can't remember her surname, is directing a Marvel movie. So these are two young Chinese American directors who have done one indie feature that have either like gone to Cannes or gone to Sundance and is now directing a big studio film. And I cannot fathom that. It's just incredible that, you know, we're in an era where that could happen. That is a possible dream to be had. So for me, in the past year, that's the biggest thing. And I actually think that they're both in the past 6 months. What has gotten me down? A recent story was when I was in LA, I was standing outside an agency, and an Uber driver was coming to pick me up. And I was standing outside CAA, which is one of the biggest agencies, and they have a crazy building. And he pulls up, he's like, "Oh, is that CAA?" And I was like, "Yeah." And I don't like talking to strangers or Uber drivers, so I was giving short worded answers. And he was like, "Oh, do you work there?" And I went, "Oh, no, I'm just speaking to them because they're trying to court me, to represent me." And he's like, "Oh, are you an intern?" I was like, "No, they want to represent me." And I'm like, "Oh, are you an agent?" And I was like, "No." It just took him so long to understand and believe that I was a director who they were speaking to about representation. And I think it's just, again, a reminder of that. It reminded me that I have not been on a single set where an extra or just a new person on the set had ever assumed that I was a director, because I'm just not the perception of what a director is meant to look like. And that is such a big cultural shift that I don't know if will ever happen in my lifetime. But that is just, you know, for me, I'm like, okay, well, that's what we have to work towards.
Pressure's on, guys.
It's okay, we've still got Lawrence's bad experience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, oh, thank God.
Oh, I remember it. I've got one. Okay, so this was when my partner is pregnant with our second child, and going into the hospitals, people always recognize me thinking that I'm a doctor. Because they've seen me so often. And so and this is another elevator story. I was in an elevator, and the nurse there was going, "Oh, are you here for that doctor conference thing? Are you from another hospital?" And I said, "No, I mean, a lot of Asians are doctors, but not every doctor is an Asian." Despite what my parents hope. So then I was there, and she realised before the elevator landed that, oh yeah, you're a doctor from Offspring, who's also a paediatrician, and she asked for a selfie, and she said, "Is that okay? I've never had a selfie with a TV, star before." And I said, "That's okay. I've never had a selfie with a nurse before." And she said, "I'm not a nurse. I'm a doctor." So I took her implicit racism and upped it with my implicit sexism.
Whoa.
So that's the low point.
Well,
that's
that
a solid
is a
story.
plot twist.
That you M. Night Shyamalan, that's
But the high point of seeing Crazy Rich Asians with my partner, and I just remember the thought of her, my baby not seeing it as an amazing thing. She told me that. I didn't come up with that thought, so I'll credit my partner for saying that, and I plagiarised her as my meaningful story.
Beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. I'm not sexist, I'm not.
Bring it home, Tony.
That was my low point for the year.
That's your low point for the year.
Completely changed my opinion on this. Nice. Well, I don't know. I sort of feel like I think right at the moment I sort of, I watch a lot of stuff and it's not really impacting on me very much. So just because it's stuff and it's work and so, my high points are Wentworth. The Karen Phelps getting in. My sort of my low points are every morning when you turn on the news. That's it, and I guess what you said just then about the way that, sometimes the people on the left, on the progressive left, just attack the wrong targets. Yeah. And I think that for me is something that I've been increasingly conscious of and aware of, and like having grown up deeply suspicious of anyone saying this is what all gay men are like, this is what all Asians are like, this is what I am deeply suspicious of anyone who tries to tell me that, whether they're from the left or from the right. I feel like, and I also have been increasingly feeling like my role as an artist is to try to point out the contradictions of intersection, actually where our identities aren't neat and don't fit together, and actually that's the best thing that we can do, because the rest of if you wanted to affect change in the world, there are other platforms that are actually more useful for that. And what we can do is put real human beings into dramatic situations and see what the fuck happens. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what's interesting about what we do. And I think that's probably the thing the conclusion that I've reached, which is probably my high point for the year. I sort of think, well, at least I know what I'm doing a bit more now.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a really beautiful note to end on. Oh, thank you. Can you please join me in thanking Tony Ayres, Corey Chen, and Lawrence Long?
And Michelle Law.
Michelle Law.
There's a yellow person attacking their television.
Yeah.
In a beautiful, circuitous way. We're going to throw it out to audience for questions. Any burning questions that anyone might have? Yeah, just in the front here.
That sticker.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Hello.
Hello. I wanted to ask how you would measure success in terms of how far down the track. What does that actually look like?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was having this conversation with my brother a couple of years ago. I think it was when I'd just written my play and I was just so relieved that it was done. But I also felt sort of this weird emptiness, because I'm someone who I don't reflect too much on what I've just finished. I'm always just ploughing ahead, hurtling towards death, because I'm just so conscious of my own mortality. But I brought this up with him because I was like, when do you know when you've made it? And he was telling me about my brother's Ben Law, and he's a writer as well. and he was telling me about when he finished his PhD, which took up years and years of his life, and that was finishing that thesis was just his goal in life. And once he finally submitted it, he was just like, I just broke down because I didn't know who I was, I didn't know what my purpose was. I just felt like that was my entire being, and now I'm just floating in the void. And so he was saying that something that he's come to terms with, and something I try to do in my own career and in my life, is that you don't measure success by your goals or achieving goals. You know, it's great to have goals and a plan and a structure, but it's actually the process that you learn to appreciate. So every time you're working on a new project, the success is the joy of the process, and having the privilege to make something new or make something at all. So that's something that I like to keep in mind whenever I'm working on something new.
That's a really good answer, and a really great question too. I think about that the same ways. I feel lucky that we get to make the things that we do. It's an absolute privilege to be able to express yourself in whatever art you want, to put it out there in the world. For some people, it's the only thing they can do. I know I can't work in an office. I have to get out there and say stuff and make stuff. So for me, I think success is having the opportunities to choose to keep doing that stuff. And yeah, there's curveballs in every which way, and often it's to do with your own self. But yeah, I think I agree, that's the process is the success.
Well, I mean, my parents pummeled into me from a young age that I wouldn't never be successful enough. So I feel like never is the answer. I'm just going to spend my life like just trying to gobble up as much power as I can and hoping that they'll say I'm proud, but it'll never come. So that's just going to be my life.
What will make them proud? Like, what did they?
Well,
they won an Oscar.
They were proud-ish for the past year because I'm working now, and they're like, cool, we don't have to worry about you financially. And then the last dinner I had, they were like, oh, but when are you gonna get nominated for an Emmy?
Yeah.
But then
Like
you did.
in that tone, like when will that be? And don't speak to us until you do. So I think for them it's just like a box ticking thing, and it's very, very stressful. But it's fine.
And it's just going to keep getting higher and higher.
No, actually, I think success for me will be when I stop defining
Worrying.
my self-worth with my career. That will be success.
I thought you were going to say defining it with your parents' expectations of you.
But just
Tell me about your mother.
No, just on what you guys both said, though, what I have realized coming back from the US is like we are so lucky here to have government funding. Everyone there is just like, what do you mean you just apply for money and you don't have connections like with someone in your family who's already working in Hollywood? Like they could not, it blew their mind that we could do that. And sure, there are a lot of fuzzy bits around that sentiment, but it's largely true. I came from a long line of Asian stereotypes. Like my grandparents were rice farmers, and my parents are, entrepreneurs that own restaurants. Like I didn't know anyone, and now I'm like sitting here. So we are so extremely lucky, and that's something that I feel really grateful for.
I think the answer's great answers.
As the most successful person on this panel, how do you feel successful? What was the point?
Thanks so much for the great question.
thank you.
I hope that was helpful. Any other?
I think this is time for our final question.
Oh,
Pressure's on. So a lot of what we talked about tonight has been representing personal Chinese Australian stories and sort of how you express that identity. But what I've noticed a bit on American shows lately, and don't judge me, such as Riverdale, there's a there's
no judgments.
Thank you. There's a guy, his name is Reggie Mantle, and he just happens to be like a hot Asian jock guy. And you've also got characters like Jason Mendoza from The Good Place, whose primary trait is not the fact that he's Asian, but he's a hot dummy, and he's from Florida, and he's really stupid. Do you think that kind of, what I would perceive to be mostly colorblind casting is a step that needs to be do you get there through representing Chinese Australian identity first, or is that a parallel track to success?
I would say it's a parallel track. I mean, I'm aware of representing my Chinese identity, but in my work I do it in a sense that it's just a part of the character. It's not the story. So for example, in Homecoming Queens, I'm playing a version of myself, and the character's race isn't the central storyline, but it's a part of her character. I think colourblind casting it can be problematic in the sense that it sort of can erase all cultural elements from a character, which I think are important to see in a three-dimensional person on screen. What are your thoughts?
For a long time, I had problems with colourblind casting because of that, because, I think a character is a whole bunch of different things. But, I think there's something positive in it, but what I would sort of say that once you've made that casting decision, then it's beholden on the creators, the writers, to then go and backfill the backstory, like to actually, like, not create... just cast a Chinese character who has who is weirdly suspended in aspic. So that's what I sort of think. I think that colourblind is great if it's taken to the next level, which is to then go backwards.
Yeah. A really good... Sorry, Corey, yeah.
I think we're about to list
we're
the
going to
same
say the
example.
same thing. Oh my God, if you say the
Yang.
same thing, I'm going to murder you.
Are you going to say Christina
Crazy
Yang?
Rich Asians?
Oh,
no, sorry, not Crazy Rich Asians, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend.
No, I'm going to say Christina Yang from Grey's Anatomy. When they cast Sandra Oh, that was exactly what they did, because she was written as like a Jewish person, but then they reverse engineered her character, and I think it's one of the greatest characters written on television. Yeah.
I was going to say Josh from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend because he's a really brilliant example, because he is the primary love interest and the who Rebecca obsesses over, and his character is just the hunky lead man, but then as you get to know him, you actually meet his Filipino family, and you learn about his background, and Rebecca becomes involved in his family, and it's again that colourblind casting but then backtracking.
And also it's a story of her objectifying him and then learning out more of who he is as a full person, just like the audience.
Yeah.
I do think that is going to happen more in Australia. I do think that that we have reached a tipping point now where, where there are enough producers who care, and networks are giving way much more, so that you do see things, and I kind of like it when it's completely unannounced, when it just kind of happens and surprises you. I think that's great. So I do think that things will change in both ways, both personal stories and also political stories. I think that there are all kinds of big historical stories that are still to be told about the Chinese in Australia. There is such a rich history that has never been mined dramatically.
Speaking of mining,
literally.
there's never been a gold rush.
Yeah.
What the hell?
Greatest story never told.
Yeah.
Although I am writing a musical about it.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much for the great question. Do we have time for one more, or are we out?
I think we've got time for one more quick question.
Okay, one more if there
Last
is
question.
one. Oh, yes.
I'm doing an honours thesis next year on representation in Australian screen, but on Vietnamese Australians, and I just want some advice on how to tackle that. Do you think in the best, fairest, most just way?
Oh gosh, I guess it depends on sort of what angle you're taking with it.
Under representation, yeah.
Yeah, right.
I would speak to Vietnamese Australians
Well, yeah.
who like in terms of on-screen cultures.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I that is definitely underrepresented, and I think I don't really know any.
Maria
Tran. Yes.
Yeah, Maria Tran.
Hey Ha. Hey Ha
Yes.
Lee.
Yeah.
Kwa Do and Do. They're the people that you should be talking to.
And there would be more
They'd
connected.
be very open to having that conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think we're at the end of our panel.
We are, and can I please get you to put your hands together for our amazing panel? Michelle, Lawrence, Corey, and Tony. Thank you all for coming to ACME Conversations.